The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow through the large front windows of Parker's Diner, situated at the corner of Maple and Third. Inside, the scent of frying bacon and brewing coffee mingled with the sweet aroma of cherry pie cooling on the counter. Patrons occupied the vinyl booths. A retired school teacher nursing a decaf at the end of a booth, two blue-collar workers in reflective vests sharing a laugh over workday woes, and a young family quietly polishing off order after order of fries. In the back, behind a counter lined with ketchup bottles and napkin dispensers, the owner, Henry Parker, polished a stainless steel pie server as he watched through narrowed eyes. There was a quiet tension in the air that only a few registered. Henry was a second-generation owner. His father had opened the diner 35 years earlier, and Henry had been running it for the past decade. Known for his no-nonsense attitude, he kept the diner spotless, the prices fair, and the clientele familiar and predictable. He prided himself on maintaining a comfortable, home-like atmosphere. But lately, the crowds had thinned a bit as new eateries popped up across town. Henry felt his grip on the neighborhood weakening. His gaze moved toward the front door when it swung open, revealing a tall, lean figure stepping in, someone Henry had not seen before. The man who entered was dressed in a dark green army field jacket, well-polished black boots, and faded blue jeans. His silver hair was cropped short. The lines on his face were steeped in both age and weariness. Underneath the field jacket, a faded olive green t-shirt bore a small insignia, a pair of crossed rifles beneath a star. The newcomer's posture was straight, military straight, as he took in the scene around him. In his right hand, he carried a folded cap that read, U.S. Army, above a row of service ribbons. In the left, a small duffel bag that looked more travel-worn than new. He moved to the counter, pausing a step before reaching for the edge. Henry Parker noticed him immediately. The veteran was black, perhaps in his late 60s. Henry felt a tightness in his chest. He was not used to seeing men of this type in his diner. He had always preferred a certain crowd, white families, local blue-collar workers, and the occasional traveling salesman. He had grown up in segregated times, and though he told himself things had changed, a flicker of old discomfort surfaced at the sight of the veteran's uniform. "Can I help you?" Henry called from behind the counter without looking up from the pie server. The veteran cleared his throat, a quiet, restrained sound that resonated with decades of military discipline. "Yes, sir," he answered in a low, measured voice. "I'd like to order a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie, please." Henry finally raised his eyes and studied the man's face. "We're about to close," he said, his voice clipped. "Everyone out of my diner in 20 minutes. I'm just finishing up." "I understand, sir," the veteran said, setting his duffel bag on the floor beside his feet. He placed the cap gently on the countertop. "Please, if you have a moment, a cup of coffee would be nice." Henry sniffed, set down his pie server, and wiped his hands on a towel. "Fine," he said, as though granting a reluctant permission. "You can have a slice and coffee, but don't expect any special treatment." The veteran inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, sir." He lowered himself onto a stool, and Henry busied himself behind the counter, loading a coffee mug into the percolator and rummaging under the pie display for a slice of the last apple pie. A hush fell as Henry poured hot coffee into a sturdy white mug, the steam curling upward. He placed the mug and the plate under the shining counter lamp just out of the veteran's reach. "That'll be $3.50, Henry said, his tone neutral but distant. The veteran reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He examined the front pile of cash, a few 20s, a handful of singles, and slid a $5 bill across the counter. "Keep the change, sir," he said. "Much appreciated." Henry's gaze flicked to the extra dollar, but he didn't acknowledge it. He returned to stocking napkins, simply nodding. "You're welcome," he murmured. Then, as an afterthought, he added, "You can sit over there," pointing to a booth tucked against the back wall, away from most of the regular customers. "Not we like to keep things comfortable around here." His emphasis on comfortable felt like a thinly veiled warning. The veteran set his wallet back in his pocket and carried his coffee mug and pie plate to the booth. He slid into the blue vinyl seat, casually removing his jacket and exposing a crisp set of medals, pinned beneath a patch that read, Vietnam Veteran. The diner's soft, humming fluorescent lights glinted off each medal. One star for valor, another for service in combat, several for years of dedicated duty. Henry Parker turned away, folding his arms behind his back, still judging the man from across the room. A few patrons glanced up, curiosity flickering across their faces. The retired school teacher at the end of the counter watched with a mild frown. She had noticed the merchant's hesitance and the veteran's unassuming patience. She sipped her tea, eyes never leaving the booth. The two blue-collar workers had paused mid-conversation. One of them nudged the other with a fork, nodding subtly toward the new arrival. A young mother glanced over at the veteran, worried for a moment before ordering pancakes for her children. At his booth, the veteran took a small paper napkin and patted the condensation from his coffee mug's handle. He raised the mug, taking a slow, appreciative sip. For a while, he simply sat there, listening to the hum of the diner, the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the low murmur of patrons exchanging stories, the jukebox in the corner playing a soft country tune. He reached for his slice of apple pie, pressed the fork into its warm filling, and took a bite with careful gratitude. His expression softened for the first time, a small, contented sigh escaping. Meanwhile, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky outside in shades of lavender and gold. Through the diner's windows, a few pedestrians strolled by, and the occasional headlights from passing cars sped past the window panes. It would soon be time for closing. Henry had already begun turning off some table lamps and checking his watch for the fifth time in a matter of minutes. Suddenly, the front door opened again, and all heads turned. A hush fell. In walked a man whose mere presence seemed to alter the atmosphere in the room. He wore a clean, crisp Army service uniform, the jacket bearing a row of gleaming ribbons above a set of badges denoting airborne and special forces qualifications. On his lapels sat 4 silver stars. Major General Wallace T. Foster, recently retired and now serving as a senior advisor to the National Guard. The general's gait was measured, professional, each step purposeful and steady. His dark blue peaked cap rested under his left arm. General Foster surveyed the scene. The booths, the checkered floor, the counter with gleaming chrome stools, and his gaze settled for a fraction of a second on the veteran in the corner, back pressed straight against the booth's vinyl. The veteran's silver hair and medals mirrored the general's own, a mirror image of service rendered and sacrifices made. Foster's deep-set eyes flickered with recognition before he turned to the counter, where Henry stood behind the register, staring back. For a long moment, the sky of conformity seemed to fragment. Henry took a breath and attempted a polite nod. "Good evening, sir," he said, voice a shade cooler than intended. General Foster returned the nod. "Good evening," he replied, his voice resonant and calm. "I'd like a cup of coffee and a slice of your cherry pie." He unbuttoned his jacket slightly and set his cap on the counter. His deep voice carried across the diner like a drumbeat. Henry swallowed hard, anxiety flickering in his eyes. "Sir, you're aware we're closing soon." The general remained unfazed. "I understand," he said. "I have a few minutes." Henry flicked a glance toward the veteran's booth, where the Vietnam veteran sat, fork halfway to his mouth. The general gave a slight nod in that direction, an unspoken courtesy, a recognition that he too saw the older man. Henry forced a polite smile and turned to prepare the order, though his hands trembled slightly. He poured fresh coffee into a tall mug, filled a plate with a slice of cherry pie as requested, and placed them before the general. "That'll be $4.25, sir." Foster slid a $10 bill onto the counter. "Keep the change," he said, then turned and carried his order to a stool at the counter, positioned just 2 seats down from where Henry stood. This put him between Henry and the veteran, a deliberate placement. The diner seemed to dim as the general sat, the muffled chatter softening to a hush. As the general sat, he looked toward the veteran. The two locked eyes briefly. In that second of acknowledgement, each saw in the other decades of struggle, honor, and shared experiences that transcended race and generation, their uniforms, their medals, and the reflections of war in their gaze. Henry, sensing the growing tension, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Can I get you anything else, General?" He avoided looking at the veteran. "No, thank you," Foster said, his voice steady. He picked up the mug and sipped the coffee, his eyes darting around the diner. "Mr. Parker, I want you to know this veteran has every right to be here, and those seats are for paying customers, which he is. Do you understand what I mean?" Henry stiffened, opened his mouth to protest, then closed it as the general's gaze bore into him. He shifted on his stool, leaned slightly forward, and nodded curtly. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. "I understand." The general set down the mug. "I'd appreciate if you let him finish his pie in peace," he said, nodding toward the veteran. "He's served just as I have." The distinction in his voice was clear. He, a 4-star general, had transcended rank to stand with a veteran of lower grade. After a moment, the veteran rose from his booth, cleared his plate, and walked toward the counter. He stopped at the general's stool, offering a gentle nod of deference. Major General Foster, he said with respect that flowed naturally from one soldier to another. Good to see you. Foster turned, his face softening. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Walt Simmons. It's been too long. He gestured toward the empty stool next to him. Please, sit down. Walt, his voice warm, sat down and removed his jacket, revealing a chest full of medals that mirrored Foster's own. The two veterans exchanged stories in low, respectful tones about campaigns fought, lost comrades honored, and the transition from battlefield to civilian life. Their conversation, threaded with camaraderie, echoed through the diner in a way that felt almost sacred, as if the here and now had given way to a shared past of sacrifice and service. Henry Parker hovered behind the counter, silent now, wide-eyed as he watched the two black veterans, along with the general, a white four-star, comparing notes, nodding at shared memories. Without words, each man's dignity filled the room. Their presence was a powerful reminder that wartime sacrifices transcended color lines, that valor and honor were not confined to a single race or generation. At one point, Walt reached into his pocket and produced a small, frayed photograph, a grainy shot of his platoon from Korea decades ago. He passed it to Foster, who traced the faces with a finger. Now, Sergeant Martinez and Corporal O'Connor weren't as lucky, he murmured. Both men fell silent for a moment, letting that loss settle between them. The diner's patrons watched, some leaning forward with hushed whispers. The retired schoolteacher dabbed her eyes with a tissue, seeing in Walt and Foster a living testament to history she had taught in textbooks, but never fully appreciated until now. The two blue-collar workers from the corner booth, once laughing and joking, sat straighter, arms resting on the table, a newfound respect in their eyes. The young mother, her children forgotten, studied the veterans with innocent curiosity, trying to understand the solemnity and the gravitas of their conversation. Henry Parker remained stationed behind the counter, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He thought back to the moment when he had shamed Walt, calling him unwelcome, refusing him rightful service. Now he felt as though a tectonic shift had occurred beneath his worldview, cracking open the defenses of his old prejudices. The general's quiet authority and Walt's dignified composure had stripped him bare of any excuse for discrimination. He pressed his lips together, and his heart began to pound, with a mix of shame and awakening. Walt excused himself to leave. He had to pick up his car from the garage and check on a neighbor's cat before nightfall. He stood, smoothing his hair and placing his cap back on his head. He turned to Henry. Thank you, Mr. Parker, he said in a calm voice, loud enough for all to hear. I appreciate the pie and coffee. Henry managed a nod, his voice barely a whisper. Good evening, Lieutenant Colonel. Walt met the general's gaze, nodded to him, and turned for the door. Outside, dusk had given way to night. Streetlights painted the sidewalk with pools of amber light. Before stepping out, Walt paused, looking back at the diner. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then he turned and walked out into the evening, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. General Foster finished his coffee and pie in silence. He placed the empty plate on the counter and signaled Henry. Keep the change, he said, setting down enough bills to cover the veteran's meal as well as his own. Henry pocketed the money, still silent, watching the general stand and place his cap under one arm. Foster approached Henry, voice low. So, I hope you'll remember, that man you just served deserves respect. Every man in this uniform has earned it. Henry swallowed, nodding slowly. Yes, sir, he managed to say, his voice thick. Thank you. Foster inclined his head and reached to turn off the overhead light above Henry's station, an unspoken signal that the diner was closed. He slid off his stool, paused by the veteran's empty booth, and placed a folded $5 bill on the seat. A small gesture of thanks, he said softly. Then Foster walked out the front door, the bell chiming as he left. The patrons watched him go. Some rose, fetching coats and gathering their things. Others simply stared, processing what they had witnessed. The retired schoolteacher tapped her spoon against her teacup, tears glistening in her eyes as though she had been given a glimpse of something profound. The young mother gathered her children, standing to kneel by their side, explaining in gentle tones how important it was to honor those who served. Henry Parker turned off the jukebox, plunging the diner into a soft hush. He walked to the back, switching off the overhead lights one by one until only the soft glow of a single lamp remained. He stood there for a moment, shoulders slumped, and exhaled a shuddering breath. The night outside was cool, and through the windows he could see Walt's figure receding into the darkness, walking steadily toward a world that still needed his kindness and his courage. As he locked the front door, Henry felt an unfamiliar knot in his chest, a mix of regret, shame, and something new: resolve. He slid the key into his pocket and turned to look at the counter one last time. The place where Walt had sat, where Foster had held court, seemed charged with the memory of that quiet confrontation. Henry blinked back tears as he whispered, "Thank you," though he didn't know to whom. Then he flipped the sign to closed, pocketed his keys, and stepped out into the night. Outside, the neon sign above the door blinked off, and the diner's windows reflected the street's quiet darkness. Henry paused, took a deep breath, and squared his shoulders. He knew that tomorrow, when he unlocked those doors, he would do so with a different heart, a heart that would serve any veteran, in any uniform, with the respect they had earned. At that moment, a cool breeze drifted through the empty sidewalk. Henry looked up at the stars, faintly visible above the diner's roof, and made an unspoken promise. Never again would he refuse service to anyone who had served his country, and never again would he let fear of change override his duty to treat every person with dignity. He walked home, the din of passing cars and distant laughter ringing in his ears, like a reminder that life moved on, changed forever by a simple act of standing up for what was right.